Guys, this Wo Long Dynasty build may be the best build in this game up to date, and it is literally insane. It almost makes you invincible, and it makes you extremely powerful. We're going to be able to apply so many permanent debuffs on enemies that will never go away, that every time you hit them, it's going to be like they're literally being hit by a truck. Every single enemy in Wo Long Fallen Dynasty is extremely vulnerable to this build. It dishes out massive damage and gives you maximum defense and almost maximum agility, meaning you get max damage, max movement, and max armor and defense, making you literally an unstoppable god in this game. This build can be completed for the most part in your first playthrough as well as New Game Plus, and all this footage is from New Game Plus, and it allows me to literally run through every boss on New Game Plus as well as every enemy in the entire game. So as you're prepping up to get your character maxed out for any future DLC that comes out in June, guys, this build is a must-have and must-try. Make sure to stick to the end of the video so that way you can see exactly how I set this up and exactly how to take advantage of this build, so that way you have literally the best character in the game. That being said, these builds take a lot of time. Make sure you guys scroll down and subscribe really quick and like the video. So this build is based around the wood virtue with some earth virtue and some metal virtue. So the wood virtue is great, obviously, because you get a ton of damage towards your wood weapons, and you also gain a bunch of health by putting a lot of points in wood, meaning my HP generally would be around 700 if I put this in any other stat. But because the wood virtue bumps up your HP dramatically, this gives me a ton of HP, boosting me up to 900 points of HP, meaning I am essentially a tank. The great thing about this build is, again, literally, I am a tank. You can see my physical resistance here is 20.5, and that's because I'm wearing a full heavy armor set that I'm going to show you in just a minute. And my defense is 668, which is rated super high, meaning whether you're playing through the regular game or New Game Plus, you're going to be able to tank hits, deal out massive damage, and melt enemies' faces off literally. Like I mentioned, I'm level 147, so you can prioritize these skills if you're a lot lower level as needed. As you can see, wood virtue, it's important that this is your main stat, whether you're the same level as me, max level, or even lower level. This is going to scale your weapon damage, and your HP. You can see, again, my HP is 909, which is insane. You can tank just about any hit from any single boss in the game. Nobody can one-shot you, essentially. The secondary stat you're going to want to go with can be a mix between metal or earth virtue. Now, I like metal virtue, especially in beginning game. If you're still towards the beginning of the game or not a New Game Plus, or even if you are, I would definitely go with metal virtue because of the spells and the stats that you're going to get, which I'm going to show you later. Metal virtue obviously affects your wizard spells spirit consumption rate, meaning your spirit consumption is going to be 71.5% of normal in this case, meaning you can cast a lot more spells, which is, again, really important for this build. So I would go with metal virtue as a secondary stat. I went with earth virtue as a third stat here with 38 points to get me just low enough on my proportions. That way I'm sitting at 59.4%. If you're not aware, 30% and lower gives you an A agility, which means you can move, dodge, and deflect a lot faster, and it costs a lot less spirit to do so. And anywhere from 30 to 60 is considered B agility, so I made sure I was just underneath 60, so that way my character could be considered B agility. You can see my weapon attack power here is 558 and 508, because both these weapons essentially scale with the wood virtue and metal virtue. And my very amazing defensive rating and physical resistance rating here, as well as spirit defense, is extremely high. And that's because the setup I'm about to show you in just a second is set up to deal out damage and take a ton of damage like crazy. You can see my stats here. So my wood virtue attack power is at 380, my metal is at 156, and my earth is at 148. The earth doesn't really matter, but the metal and obviously having the wood virtue as high as you can get it is very good. This means I'm going to do a ton of damage with my shock ability as well as my melee weapon. So I'll go ahead and show you my gear and then show you all the special effects added up at the end. You should be using this set. Now keep in mind, while I'm glancing over my weapons real quick, you can see the set bonus I have here is the Grace of Ling Bao set activated. Now, if you're a New Game Plus, obviously if you want to farm for this set, I have a video down in the description for the perfect place to farm for this set, but this set bonus is insane. So if you're not familiar, the Grace of Ling Bao set gives you these following advantages, which is almost entirely what we're going to base this build off of. So the first effect you get here is spirit vulnerability on enemy upon martial arts. Then you're also going to get power drop on enemy upon wizardry spell and a damage amplification effect, as well as negative effect duration on enemies. These are your 4 main ones. I'll go over Principle of a Ling Bao in a second, but these set up the entire premise of the build. This build not only deals out massive damage, but the whole point is for you to get status effects on enemies, such as these debuffs. And once you meet the requirement to get these debuffs on your enemy, you're not only going to do an extra large chunk of damage to the enemy, but every single second that you have these debuffs on means you're going to continue to do more damage. And this build actually has a very tricky way to keep these on almost permanently without almost ever having to worry that they're actually going to go off of the enemy, meaning you can have permanent debuffs on the enemy. And finally, this set also gives us the principle of Ling Bao, meaning for each debuff up to 3 debuffs, you get damage amplification effects, meaning if you have 3 debuffs on your enemy, which is essentially easy to get in like 1 second with this build, that means you gain a 22% damage increase on that enemy that you're fighting. And again, with this build, we can put 3, 4, 5, 6 debuffs on an enemy and essentially use one spell and keep every single one of those debuffs on him almost for the entire fight, meaning on top of all these insane effects that we already have on the enemy, we're going to do an increased 22% extra damage, which is literally nuts. I mean, you run through enemies, it's not even fair. So first, the weapon that I chose to use, and you can use a different weapon, it really technically doesn't matter. I just love the effects that are on this weapon as well as the scaling, are the bronze dual swords. Now this weapon scales fairly well with wood and with water. I don't have a bunch of points in water, meaning I'm missing out on some attack power, but it's fine because this build, these weapons, and the setup do plenty of damage anyways. And my secondary are the dual halberds of Lady Hao, and these have much higher attack power. But this is the setup that I like because it's easy and it's fun to play. You can see this weapon is a part of the Grace Ling Bao set, helping to give me those effect bonuses. And the only 2 things I have on this weapon are damage to enemies with shock, as well as lightning attack power, meaning we're just going to deal extra lightning damage to the enemy. And on the dual halberds of Lady Hao, I have power drop on enemy upon martial arts and lightning attack power. So this is one of the key points to this build. Whether you're using the Grace of Ling Bao set or not, you want to have as many of these special effects on your gear as you can. So since our Grace of Ling Bao set offers 3 of these effects, if you currently have the entire set, what you're then going to do is pick as many different effects as you can besides these 3 that the Ling Bao set comes with and try and add them onto your weapons. So you can see I have Spirit Vulnerability, Power Drop, and Damage Amplification already. The only thing I could currently use on this weapon was Power Drop on enemy upon martial arts, which is fine because currently the only Power Drop I have is upon Wizardry Spell, meaning whether I do a Wizardry Spell or martial arts, that debuff is going to apply to the enemy, meaning I can just apply debuffs easier overall, so that's perfectly fine. But you're going to continue to put these on every piece of gear that you possibly can. That way you can actually transfer as many debuffs as possible to the enemy, because like I said, here in a minute I'm going to show you we have a way to keep those debuffs on the enemy the entire fight. Here I'm just using a regular repeating crossbow. That's a 3-star weapon, but I have the enemy status effect accumulation on this weapon, giving me a bonus to status effect accumulation, which is perfectly fine for this build, and overall damage dealt ability and lightning attack power to boost our lightning damage and our overall lightning attack power. Now for the very important part is the gear. So these are different pieces of armor that I farmed that have the Grace of Ling Bao set on them, so I can have the set active. So some of these, if you look at the top, have permanent effects on them that you can't get rid of, but that is fine. Here we're going to go over the stats that you want to have. So here you have lightning attack power. Again, you want to have this on as many items as possible. We have shock accumulation on enemies, poison accumulation on enemies, allowing us to stack these accumulative effects to give us extra damage overall. And then we have slow on enemy upon Wizardry Spell. Again, this is a debuff that you put on the enemy that's going to help you not only do damage, but help you win these fights way easier. Like I mentioned, all these debuffs, as many as you can get on these pieces of gear and weapons. On this gear, we have Wood Face Spell Spirit Consumption. This is just for wood skills that we're going to cast. We have lightning attack power again, and shock accumulation on enemies. So that way, again, we get that accumulation for shock, meaning we can 1 or 2 hit enemies and apply the actual shock debuff to them directly. Next on our gauntlets, we have power gain upon deflecting a critical blow. Now this isn't a debuff on the enemy, but this is good to have, meaning if we deflect a critical blow from an enemy, which typically comes right before we actually are able to do a fatal strike on them, they're going to attack us with a critical blow, we're going to deflect it, they're going to go into a state where we can do a fatal strike, and because we just deflected a critical blow, we're going to get power gain, meaning we do extra damage on top of the millions of other effects that we have that give us extra damage. So that's great. Lightning attack power, obviously, again, shock accumulation on enemies. So we build up our shock accumulation. And then for our greaves, we have, again, lightning attack power, damage dealt overall. That way it increases our overall damage, shock accumulation, and poison accumulation. Again, for shock, and so that way we can boost our poison accumulation because we can cast 1 spell on an enemy and get poison accumulation on them as long as we have a couple effects like this that boost that accumulation skill. And if you don't notice, this is all heavy armor, which is why we have such insane defense and physical resistance and spirit defense with a B agility rating, meaning we can move around insanely quick, do a ton of damage, and tank almost any single fight. And I'm going to show you that here in just a second. But in New Game Plus, I think this is possibly maybe the best build there is because of the defense, tankiness, damage ability. Everything is literally almost an A+ in my book. And for the accessories, I just picked 2 random 5-star accessories. So I made sure to pick the accessories that have lightning attack power, and the rest of these effects are just kind of whatever. But as long as it has lightning attack power for this build, you should be good to go. And for our skills, we're going to be using lightning weapons. Lightning weapon we're going to be using to not only deal lightning damage, but apply that status effect to the enemy. And in 1 or 2 hits, we're going to be able to apply that effect. Perfect Restoral. Perfect Restoral is going to give us a free hit from an enemy, meaning where we could have put a damage ability here, this is going to give us another defensive ability against bigger bosses. So that way you can constantly cast this and activate it on your player to basically tank a big hit or critical blow and deal almost no damage ever as long as you keep this activated. Next, we're going to have Heaven's Rage, meaning we're going to call down lightning. And with this build, if y'all have done a wood build, y'all should know this actual skill does a ton of damage. This spell does a lot of damage. It can literally just destroy them almost instantly. And Venom Snare, this is one of the most important parts of the build. This is because it allows us to poison the enemy. And when we poison the enemy, special things happen. This is the reason that you can keep debuffs on an enemy the entire fight. I'm going to go ahead and show you that now, but this is why poison is so broken in this game. And again, Metal Virtue, when you have 40 points, this is why you want to have 40 points, so that way you can actually use the Venom Snare skill. Otherwise, you can't use it. You have to have 40 points in Metal Virtue, which is why I say go Wood, Metal Virtue, and then Earth Virtue. If you need to lower your agility rating, just enough. That being said, I'm going to go ahead and show you now why this is so insane, how to use this build, and how we can get all these debuffs on enemies, keep them on the entire fight, and why we don't hardly ever have to break a sweat with this build, and why it's so fun. So all of this build does seem complex. This is exactly how we're going to proceed with actually using this build. So when you're fighting a boss, the very first thing you're going to do is want to cast Venom Snare on the enemy. This applies a poison effect, and it applies any debuffs that you have currently on your armor or weapons. For putting a debuff on the enemy with a wizardry spell, this is the first thing you want to do so you can get your first 2 or 3 debuffs on the enemy and also have them take poison damage. Next, you're going to want to cast Lightning Weapon, so that way you can hit the enemy 1 or 2 times and also put the lightning effect on them. Then if you haven't, make sure to hit the enemy with a martial arts hit. That way we can stack as many of these debuffs as possible, as well as a fatal strike if you have a debuff for it once you get to that point. Now once you've applied your debuffs from poison, lightning, debuffs from fatal strikes, wizardry spells, etc., you'll see the enemy start stacking all of those debuffs in the top left corner of your screen. Now this is the really important part. So if you can see, every debuff is not reducing in its time that it's on the enemy. This is because the only one that's actually reducing is poison. Poison for some reason in this game, and I don't know if it's just broken or it's meant to be this way, which is why we cast Venom Snare at the beginning. What this poison effect allows when on the enemy is it allows all the other debuffs to be negated in the time that they're reduced. So if you have a poison debuff successfully on an enemy, all of your other debuffs do not go down until the poison goes all the way to 0. Meaning if you keep applying Venom Snare and keep applying poison and the debuff to your enemies, your other debuffs will never go away. They just stay there permanently, meaning you do probably 100% extra damage on your enemy with all the other effects said and done that you have. This is why the build is so OP. So apply poison, apply all your debuffs via attacks, spells, etc. And then just go to town, because this will reduce the enemy's spirit meter like mad consistently. It literally drops an enemy's spirit meter almost instantly. Most enemies within 5 seconds you can completely break their spirit meter, meaning you can get a fatal strike and large damage attack on them. And like I mentioned earlier, this is a New Game Plus, and it completely dominates. That being said, once you get the hang of this technique, you can also begin to swap in your other damage abilities like Heaven's Rage, one of your biggest damage abilities on this build, as well as Perfect Restoral. You can continually apply Perfect Restoral to your character. That way you get the buff from that, and basically it negates an attack entirely. This build is tanky as it is, but this makes you completely almost invincible at some points in time. Now, one thing I recommend while generally running regular levels and questing is to swap out one of these skills with the Lightning Bolt ability. That way you can use a low morale skill and high damage skill on enemies as you're going through levels. This gives you an extra damage ability that for the most part generally will do a lot of damage to enemies. This will give you an extra spell to use and debuff to help you apply to enemies in general, as well as the huge damage bonuses that you get from it. You can see just regularly playing levels here, this build isn't just great for bosses, it's great for every enemy in the game, making it extremely overpowered, but now necessary in my heart to play. If you cast one spell on an enemy period, they almost get instantly 2 or 3 debuffs. And like I mentioned with the bosses, if you apply poison and cast a poison spell ahead of time, this means that regular enemies gain even more debuffs on them, making you do more damage to them, as well as having that 3 buff bonus from the Principle of Ling Bao set bonus, meaning you're doing like 50 to 100% extra damage compared to a lot of other builds in this game, and constantly stacking debuffs on every single enemy that you come up against, whether you're intentionally trying to or not, which is the great part about this build. You don't even have to try sometimes for these things to happen. Go down to the comments, let me know your thoughts on this build, and drop a like on the video if you haven't already and you enjoyed it. That being said, I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.